So, is Rishi's five-point plan going to work? Some of your thoughts coming in from our viewers and our listeners. One says, is he going to clear the backlog by allowing them all to stay without proper scrutiny? That's exactly what I thought. That's the easy way of doing it, isn't it? Just give everyone permanent leave to remain. Clive says, one thing having a plan, another thing implementing that plan. Let's wait and see, but I'm not holding my breath on anything Sunak says. And look, you know, as Derek says, the big announcement today was the same old, does not offer any practical solutions. And that's why, folks, I played you those clips of David Cameron and Boris Johnson saying precisely the same thing that Rishi Sunak said today. Now, Mick Lynch is a charismatic leader of the RMT, and we have a series of strikes, of course, going on. Postal worker strikes, the nurses going out for the first ever national strike. They're due to go out this Thursday. I have to say, I've got some sympathy with the postal workers, many of whom stand to lose a lot of money. I have less sympathy for those who are not going to get pay rises in line with inflation, although those on lower money, we could see a raising of tax thresholds perhaps to help. But generally, the public have been quite sympathetic to those that want to go on strike because the public too are suffering from the cost of living. Mick Lynch has played the game thus far, I think, very well. He's been a bit of a media star. He's run rings around several interviewers. But this morning, something really seemed to change. On a series of media networks, he was being asked the question, well, Mick Lynch, are you really Mick Grinch? Are you going to spoil Christmas for loads of people? Here's how he responded to Radio 4's Today programme this morning.
What's wrong with just saying, on average, our members have sacrificed X numbers of thousands of pounds? You've said they're making a sacrifice. What's wrong with putting a number on it?
Well, why do you need that number?
Because I'm interested in the level of sacrifice.
Well, why aren't you interested in what Network Rail and the government are doing to working people across this country, impoverish them every day?
What's wrong with you actually putting a number on the sacrifice that you say your members are making?
But why does that interest you, Michelle?
Because we're in a cost of living crisis, because it's in the run-up to Christmas.
Well, why don't they give us a decent pay rise then? Why don't you pursue that?
And because you say your members are making a sacrifice. Now, it was estimated at £1,500 on average in the summer. What's the amount now?
Well, why are you pursuing an editorial line that I could read in The Sun or the Daily Mail or any of the right-wing press in this country, and you're not pursuing the fact that working people, millions of them, are being impoverished and some of them made destitute by the attitude of this government and by their employers?
Well, a very ratty Mick Lynch there. And I mean, goodness me, if he's accusing Radio 4's Today programme of being agents of right-wing propaganda, I begin to wonder whether he's lost the plot. And by the way, I've been in those situations where you do start to get angry with the interviewer, but you never, ever come out as a winner. He went on later on to say something really very, very stupid. He was asked by Richard Madeley, well, surely what you're doing with these strikes are damaging pubs, restaurants, small businesses who rely on this next fortnight as being their most important time of the year. You're ruining people's Christmas. He said, oh, well, as far as I'm concerned, Christmas doesn't start till Christmas Eve. Not clever. Now, William Atkinson joins me, assistant editor of Conservative Home, and Peter Edwards is back, former editor of Labour List. Peter, I put it to you, the government strategy on this has been very simple. It's do nothing, don't really have much of a negotiation with any of the unions, and hope that public support starts to crack. That's really what the government's been doing, isn't it?
I'd say so, yes. But I mean, we also must remember this isn't like the situation in, say, the 70s, when the government actually owned most of these industries. These are largely private industries, aside from, of course, the nurses' strike and the NHS. So these are pay disputes between private companies and their employees. Mick Lynch can demand that Rishi Sunak comes and spends Christmas Day with him all he likes, but this is actually something for the companies to deal with. And I think the government has been very clear on its approach. These pay rises largely are unaffordable, both for the private companies and also in the public sector. And the government has a simple priority, which is to get inflation down. And we're only going to get inflation down if we're not agreeing to these huge pay rises that they're demanding.
Biggest set of strikes since the winter of discontent, 78-9, coming up. Last time it was a Labour government who suffered, I think, grievously, electorally, as a result of all of this. It is a fair point William makes, though, isn't it? A lot of these are now private companies. But I want to ask you, the Tory strategy has been just do nothing, and hope it all goes away and hope public support falls. Did you feel that today Mick Lynch was starting to lose the room?
Well, I do think the government's strategy was slightly different. It was to do nothing, but it was also to seek a political benefit from a long drawn-out ideological battle with trade unions. So I think by saying nothing, they're doing more than nothing. They're hoping to win an argument and wrongly and unfairly characterise
Well, so they want these strikes? The government wants these strikes?
No, I don't think they want these strikes, but I think they can see an ideological opportunity to prosecute a right-wing applicant. Because if you like...
I would say the only ideologue here is Mick Lynch, as the mask slipping on Radio 4 this morning showed.
But, William, to be fair, I didn't talk across you. So I think, the government has talked less about resolving the strikes and having negotiations. They've talked more about additional anti-trade union legislation, which tells me they're trying to reshape a country in their own image rather than put train drivers and passengers and patients and doctors first. In terms of Mick Lynch, I do think the BBC...
Is William right? Did the mask slip this morning?
No, I don't think it's a mask slip. I think the BBC is impartial and, I think BBC presenters are used to both people from the left and from the right picking fights with them. That probably indicates the BBC isn't about the right place. But let's go to public support, because I think, what's Mick Lynch's job? He wants to do well for his members, get a few more quid in their pocket, and he wants to carry a degree of public support. So as you acknowledge, he's been very effective arguing for members, but I think in terms of the ballot results so far, he'll still be fairly pleased. And I looked into some of the stats because I think RMT members backed the Mick Lynch position by about 66%. Boris Johnson won an election with 44%.
That is not a straight comparison. You know that as well as I do in a multi-party democracy. What was interesting, I thought, was that RMT ballot was an 83% turnout. He got 63% of that. So we're now up to a third of those that are voting in RMT elections, voting against their own leader. That minority is growing all the time. Where does Keir Starmer really stand on this? Because I can't work it out.
Keir Starmer has a political dilemma, as any leader of the opposition does when a strike happens. I actually believe he stands on the side of rail passengers and hospital patients. Bear in mind, although there are Labour voters among the RMT, that is not affiliated to the Labour Party. So this is not a Labour Party-backed strike in any way. And we remember Ed Miliband going through one or two uncomfortable interviews 10 years ago when similar things happened. But if Keir Starmer presents himself as a patients' champion or the passengers' champion against an ideologically driven government, I think that's the right place to end up.
An ideologically driven government? Well, maybe not. But let's just turn our minds, if we can, to the proposed nurses' strike, the first ever full national nurses' strike. Are the government doing enough to stop this?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a question of trying to stop it if the nurses are hell-bent on being unreasonable. The reason why nurses haven't struck in over, in 100 years, so in their entirety of their history of this organisation, is because people traditionally saw nursing as a vocation.
And why are they being unreasonable?
Because I think they just want more money. And I think, frankly...
Well, everyone wants more money.
Well, no, exactly. But if their profession, as they say it is a vocation, then they surely should be putting the safety of their patients ahead of everything else. And in doing this, they're only going to make the winter crisis that we're facing in the NHS even worse. And I think they might point to the fact that private sector workers have seen pay rises of, say, 4 or 5% over the last year. But most public sector settlements have also been that over this year. So public sector pay is very rapidly catching up with private sector pay.
May I say,
Peter, what would a fair deal be for the nurses?
By the way, I think that point is very unfair. We're not talking about more pay. We're talking about how bad the hit is going to be. Viewers aren't stupid. Viewers get there's inflation. Nurses are merely trying to mitigate that.
Well, the problem is their demand is well above inflation because they argue they've fallen behind over the course of the last few years. Claims of up to 19% just aren't sensible, are they?
Well, they're not going to get it. And, there's we're in negotiations now on the brink of Christmas, but we've had a cost of living crisis for about 18 months. Some trade unions are seeking a catch-up. No one is going to get 19%.
No.
The curious thing to me... And Labour Party haven't backed 90% either. I think Labour Party just want each side to talk to each other. The curious thing to me is that in a pay dispute, the Health Secretary turns up to a negotiation without a pay offer.
Well, I tell you what, isn't it interesting? It's old-fashioned party politics. It's Conservative versus Labour. Over the trade unions, goodness me.